Support comes from the Seattle Rep, presenting Freak the Mighty, a world premiere musical from the Tony Award-winning producers of Come From Away. Based on the beloved novel by Rodman Philbrick, this heartwarming story of friendship, resilience, and growing up follows two outsiders whose bond transforms their lives. On stage starting July 30th. Tickets at seattlerep.org.
Support comes from the Seattle Public Library, announcing Summer Quest, a new summer learning program for all ages. Participants can read, do, and go to complete squares on a tracker and win prizes. Trackers are available at all library locations and at spl.org/summerquest.
Y'all, the sun is shining as I record this, which means it is summer reading time. Although the books we choose right around now don't always have to be quite so sunny, my picks rarely are. I'm Katie Campbell, and this is a bonus episode of Meet Me Here, KUOW's Arts and Culture podcast. This week, we're getting bonus lit with Ray Nayler, author of the hit novel The Mountain in the Sea. And that book was popular in Seattle. Still is. I still see it on staff recommendation shelves all around town. But y'all, his new novel, which I just finished, might be even better, especially for Seattle readers. Ray Nayler's new novel is about four young people caught between the Nazis and the Red Army in World War II. Not ideal. They're stuck in the woods midwinter, left to fend for themselves and each other against, well, a lot. I mean, one of them is a young Jewish girl whose home is burned to the ground. You've also got an underage Polish soldier. There's also an abandoned boy and a Roma girl whose family is on the run from the Soviets and Nazis, and pretty broad discrimination against her nomadic people when all of this unfolds. There's a lot going on, and it's hard. So you might be asking yourself, why do I think this is going to be such a hit in Seattle? Well, because the kids aren't entirely alone in the woods. They have the help of one of Seattle's favorite flyers, crows. Yes, a flock of highly intelligent crows, redundant, I know, help our human protagonists in really unique ways. The book is called Palaces of the Crow. I couldn't tell you that before because it would have ruined the reveal. And it's perfect for fans of historical fiction, speculative fiction, corvid fiction, which should totally be a genre of its own. We're not doing spoilers in this episode, but I did have to talk to Ray while he was in town, touring with his next novel that I think is going to have Seattle talking. Hello, Ray.
Hi, Katie.
Your first book, or your 2022 novel, The Mountain in the Sea, was huge in Seattle. And I really do think you're back with another one that's going to have this town really excited.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I hope so. I heard that Seattle is very, very into its crows.
Yeah, we are. I was going to say corvid curious in Seattle, but it's so much more than that.
Right.
What do you think it is about crows that we as humans, we as Seattleites, just kind of can't get enough of?
You know, I think crows are one of those animals that we recognize ourselves in. They're super curious about the world. They're born problem solvers. They're big group animals, so they form these big communities. They love to talk, obviously. You hear them talking to each other all the time. And there's just something about them that, like octopuses, which was the subject of The Mountain and the Sea, just sort of attracts our interest. I think we see ourselves in them.
Yeah. I will say, in my classic me style, my intro there was a little more peppy than the book is. This is a very serious story dealing with a lot of really real violence that occurred. And this addition of the crows kind of made it feel like some medicine for my heart while the story was going through. Why did you want to bring crows into it?
I think for me, this is a story about these four kids who are trying to make it in the woods in a very dark time, probably one of the darker times in the 20th century. But it's also a story about care and about the ways in which care kind of moves from one generation to another, right? So the crows have had a relationship before with humans, and that's maybe one of the reasons why they protect the children the way that they do in the book. although we're never really certain what the motivations of the crows are, just like I think we're never really certain what the motivations of crows are in real life.
Yeah.
And I try to avoid anthropomorphizing animals.
Yeah, you have a really unique way of writing about animals without doing that, without making it like, even in this book, some of the crows are given very human names. You've got Buster, who's really core to the kid's story. How do you strike that balance without making them too human, or without needing to make them too human?
I think I allow my characters to anthropomorphize the crows because, of course, these are kids and they're going to name birds and they're going to want to try to understand, why they're doing what they're doing. And they're going to, like Buster, who's named after Buster Keaton, attribute their behaviors to behaviors that people have and that sort of thing. But I think we need to remember as people that animals are not us. Right, that they aren't just little humans in different forms walking around, but that they have their own points of view. And those points of view come from the ways their bodies are constructed and the ways that they live together in groups. So for me, it's kind of a line between making the animal understandable to readers enough that they can somehow have empathy with them without changing them into just another human being in a different form. And, luckily my readers are all humans. So I don't have to. Right? As far as I know, my readers are all humans and no crows will be reading this book.
Right.
So that helps out because, if I get something wrong about crow culture, there's no crows, hopefully, to tell me about it.
Who send you an email and are like, I have a bone to pick with you, guy.
Right.
I'm glad you just said that because early in the book, one of your main characters asks a question that's stuck in my craw. Or my caw, because it was so lovely, but just kind of in passing, she thought, what is crow hospitality like? And I love that. I love the way this particular character looks at the crows and kind of studies them and gets to know them. But what do you think it's like?
Crow hospitality. Well, I think we sort of find out in a way, no spoilers, but I think you will kind of see what it might be like. I think what it's going to be is very different from what you might think of as hospitality. But then again, right, and I think it was here in Seattle where you had a little girl, who was being given gifts by crows.
Yes.
And she's one of the inspirations really for this book. So, we know that they are gift givers, that they expect gifts from us, that they reward behaviors from humans that they like, that they punish behaviors that they don't like. We know a little bit about maybe what their social structures are like. And in some ways, that gift-giving structure is very human. It's just that we don't know the motivations behind what they're doing, right? But we understand that they can form relationships with us. And so something that I kind of wanted to explore is that interspecies relationship.
Yeah. And it probably looks a little like that care that you were talking about, like care in this case being warnings to these kids when they're in danger.
Yeah, and I think you see this with, we live in Washington, D.C., my family, and we have a kind of mixed group of birds that lives out behind our house in this near Rock Creek Park. And there's some crows, a few of them, and there's a lot of house sparrows, and there's a few robins and other birds. And it's interesting because they kind of mix together in these big groups. And you can see that they help each other out and that they warn one another. So the crows will warn all the birds when there's a hawk coming, for example, right? And they will mob together to drive hawks off and to protect their children. And I thought that was also really interesting that birds aren't really very exclusive about species, especially when they're not competing a lot over resources.
Right. So are you like a crow connoisseur, or maybe a better question, do you have some crow friends that inspired the birds in this book? So
when I was a Peace Corps volunteer, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Turkmenistan from 2003 to 2005. Wow. And when I was living there, I lived in this kind of Soviet apartment block. You can imagine this kind of gray concrete buildings. And for some reason, Ashgabat was this gathering place in the winter for crows. And they would come in by, I think it's not an exaggeration to say they came in by the millions, because you would see these flocks of crows coming in the evening as the sun set, and it would be hundreds of thousands of birds, like so many birds that you could only really measure them by how long it took them to fly over you. And it would be 10 minutes sometimes of just crows coming in constantly. And they would fill every single tree in the city, like this just black fruit, and the trees would just shake with crows. And so you'd hear them all night long, like waking up, having their arguments, kind of shifting around, settling in and resettling, getting startled by something like a backfire or something and suddenly taking flight and then coming back. And so they were just this part of daily life. And then years later, my family lived in Kosovo, and we lived under a sort of local park. There was a park on the top of the hill. We were a couple streets down. And in the evening, the crows who lived in that park during the daytime would fly to a central park in the center of the city and roost with other crows there. And so they would take off all in a group, and they would fly over our house, and we had this big window where you could just watch them fly past. Wow. And Kosovo is a really interesting place because, in fact, Kosovo means blackbird.
Oh.
And probably means crow, actually.
Sure.
Right? It just means like a bird that is black, not a black bird. And Kosovo was just completely filled with corvids. So there were these huge groups of corvids in the park, and it would be jackdaws and crows and ravens and rooks and like every sort of corvid you could think of. And different kinds of crows. So there would be the hooded crow, which is the ones that are in the palaces of the crow. They're the not the crows that you would have here in Seattle. They are black-headed but gray in their body and then have black wings.
Right.
And then there's the carrion crow, the sort of common one that you see that's the all-black crow. And so they're just a constant presence in our lives, and they're constantly coming to our house and sitting on the roof and throwing walnuts onto the pavement. And also there were a lot of stray dogs in the neighborhood, and the crows they would fly down and they would pull the dog's tails.
Oh my!
They would do this in pairs. So one of them would distract the dog, like go walking across the street, and the dog would be looking at that crow, and then the other crow would come up and kind of tweak its tail.
That's amazing.
And fly off.
Wow.
And they would do this over and over again.
Yeah.
It was clearly like a game
for
them, right? Like, let's go and bug the stray dogs.
Totally double dog dare you.
Yeah, exactly. And pretty dangerous game, right? But they've always just been like a part of my life, I feel like. And I've always just been amused by them. I think that when crows walk around, they look like these little old gentlemen with their hands behind their backs, kind of, just walking in the park, right? Kind of strutting.
Sauntering.
Yeah. And there's just something very, you watch them looking at the world and thinking about things, and you can clearly see this, very, very attractive curiosity that they have, and this real sense of like self.
Yeah. They're individual even when they are in those great big flocks. It sounds a little like maybe your travels through the world influenced the setting too then. I mean, you mentioned like Soviet architecture, and obviously this setting is heavily influenced. You have a lot of conversation about like shtetl. Is that how you would pronounce that?
Yeah.
Both how they existed at the time and how they were later rebuilt. Can you talk a little bit about why this setting and why this time, this space for this book?
Yeah. So the book is set in Lithuania. Originally, it was going to be set in Belarus, but I can't go to Belarus to do research, and I'm the kind of person that really wants to, like, literally get my hands dirty. So, at one point I was in a forest meadow, down on my hands and knees, photographing every single plant that I could find so that I could look each one of them up and make sure that when I described the plants in the books, they were the actual plants that are in the Lithuanian forest. And so if I can't do that, then I decided I would shift the setting to a place where I had access to, but that was still on the Eastern Front in World War II. And it turned out to be actually really lucky because Vilnius is such an interesting city to the Pale of Settlement, the area that the Jews were allowed to settle in the Russian Empire. Vilnius was called the Jerusalem of the North. Oh. And up until the pogroms around the time of World War I, Vilnius, actually about half of its population was Jewish, and it lived pretty integrated. Afterward, it fell to about a third because there was a lot of emigration to the United States, to other places after it became much harder to be a Jew in the Russian Empire. Of course, during World War II, almost the entire Jewish population of Lithuania was exterminated. They did not go to death camps. It's not the Holocaust that we think of. This was a very personal one. So most of them were shot. Their shtetls were burned, and they were basically put in ghettos in Vilnius and other cities, and eventually those ghettos were liquidated. I thought that, first of all, I wanted to bring that Jewish life of Vilnius back to life and kind of look at it at that world, which is completely gone now, this sort of Yiddish European world, through the eyes of this little girl. I also wanted to bring together a cast of the kind of characters that you don't usually think about in World War II. This young Polish boy who's in the Red Army because he doesn't want to be purged, right? So he joins the Red Army at 14. This young Roma girl whose family is trying to escape Soviet persecution. They basically are trying to escape being forced to settle.
Yeah.
And this young boy who's traumatized by war and doesn't speak. And by kind of bringing together these very different people from different backgrounds and showing how they can help one another, I wanted to show the other side of World War II. World War II was this massive inferno, and it killed 50 million people. But it also was a time of extraordinary courage for many people. And there are so many stories that I came across while I was doing research and that I had known about before of perfect strangers risking their lives for people to protect them, risking their lives to protect children. There were women in Lithuania who took Jewish babies from the ghetto and protected them throughout the war, which was, and that could get you killed. And just many, many people who sacrificed themselves for others. And I thought, I want to tell the story not just about the horror and the brutality of World War II, but also about this wondrous, selfless thing that emerges from people in these times of great stress.
Yeah, like our Polish soldier, Czesław?
It's Czesław.
Czesław.
Yeah.
He's like he's because you play with time, you kind of bounce back through, just a few years ago all the way to 30 years into the future, but he has these flashbacks of, like, for example, saving a man, like running through no man's land to go save someone at 14.
Yeah.
And the setting being what it is, the time being what it is, I think it made it so much more believable in a way, because there were incredible things done against humanity, but to protect it too.
Yeah, I think it's amazing. I think it's not just that people risked their lives for strangers, but that people died for strangers. Right. That they gave their lives up to help other people. And there's so many stories that we probably will never know of self-sacrifice just because there's no one to tell those stories. And we're also losing World War II because the people who lived through it are slowly passing, away. Speaking of the sort of stories that you come across, one of them was a partisan's memoir of a young girl who is partially kind of what Nydia, the protagonist in the book, is sort of based on, and she lived in a shtetl that was taken over by the Nazis and then became a partisan, in the forest, and ended up raiding the same the shtetl and killing the Nazis that that destroyed her shtetl, and just became this amazing person. And you read through this memoir, and then it talks about how she eventually immigrates to Canada, and she becomes the owner of like a little dry cleaning and tailor in Toronto. And there's this picture of her, and she's this lovely grandma, right? And you think, like, you would just never know that this lovely grandma, right, just sitting there behind the counter at your local dry cleaner, was a partisan and just, like this incredibly brave 16-year-old girl raiding, the Nazi commandants in her village. Amazing.
That was her power, probably, right? Like, you look at her and you're like, she's not a threat. Much like your Roma character, Kizia.
Kazia.
Yes. Thank you so much for this lesson in these names. It's just such a great collection of people and collection of experiences, all adjacent to, again, the crows. So this is all unfolding while this character unto itself, this flock of hyper-intelligent crows, is there. So there are similarities, as we're talking about, that I see between Palaces of the Crow and The Mountain in the Sea. But of course, like, the main difference, I think, is the time.
Right.
In Mountain in the Sea, you're kind of envisioning this, doesn't feel so distant today in the future.
Right.
There's some technology that, we may or may not work towards, and we may or may not want to work towards. And in this book, this is historical fiction. You have gone back into the past.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you want to do that? Why did you take such a huge step back from what you did with the Mountain and the Sea?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons is I think that we still live in the world that World War II created. We very much, although we seem far away from it in time, in human terms, right? We're still within living memory of the war, just barely, but we're still there. And we're definitely still living in a world that was created by the war. The national boundaries that we are living with, and in a lot of places, are boundaries that World War II helped to create. The political structures that came out of World War II, right? The way that the Security Council is structured in the United Nations, the United Nations itself. And then when you look at our technologies, right, there's really 4 huge technologies that are born out of World War II. They are radar, the rocket, the atomic bomb, and then massive computation.
Yeah.
Right? And so we really live in a world under the shadow of all those things, You can't really, in some ways, talk about our present moment unless you talk about World War II. And then I think, also World War II is when you have this, World War I is the beginning of it, but by World War II, war itself becomes a technological matter. Human beings more and more are just at the mercy of massive technologies. The war that was fought in the Pacific, for example, was fought basically between ships and planes,
right?
Not people in a way, right? And in Europe, you had these huge battles fought almost entirely by armored vehicles like Kursk, where it was just thousands upon thousands of tanks. And so the rise of technology, and in the way that it kind of starts to dwarf humanity, is another thing that comes out of World War II. So it seemed natural to me to set a science fiction novel in World War II, because that's kind of where we have this global change. And, where I would say, you could argue that World War II is the moment when we begin living in a science fictional world, right? That after World War II, we will start to live in a world that is science fictional.
Yeah.
That before World War II, we're living in a very kind of modernist world that's still very human. But after World War II, technology just accelerates and comes to dominate so much of our lives.
Totally.
Right.
Even changes the genre, right? Like we start to see more modern science fiction and envisioning space travel, envisioning flying cars.
Absolutely.
Robots at home, all of those things.
Right. And a science fiction increasingly, as you kind of move on, that's like less and less naive about the use of technology.
Totally.
Right? That really starts to examine the use of technology in a deeper way, because it's seeing how it's used
in
the real world. Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned this, because there's a passage that I want to read. Throughout the core story, you've sprinkled these bits and pieces from a book that's called The Autobiography of a Burned Village. And we won't give away what that's all about, but this is one of the passages that stuck with me. Then the war began. We were all the same, all soldiers. What we risked equally. But as the war dragged on, the seams appeared. Suddenly, this uniformed man, identical to any other, was a Pole. That one was a Tatar. This man was a Finn, and that one a Jew. And what kind of Jew? We found ourselves around smaller and smaller fires, not warming our hands with other Jews, but only with other Jewish workers. Soon our enemies were not only the soldiers in the trenches across no man's land, but also our officers and our sergeants, and the anarchists, and the Mensheviks, and the Bundists, and the royalists. And the fabric of empire rotted and would hold no stitch at all. That was really incredible. I loved these passages throughout. They were very thoughtful. But this one seemed to suggest to me, in the same way we're talking about we live in the shadow of World War II, that maybe you were thinking about the labels put upon people in that same shadow. Is that fair to say?
So, of course, this book, The Autobiography of a Burned Village, right, is written by someone who's talking about the experience of World War I.
Right.
Right. And I think the experience of World War I and World War II are this sort of the progressive death of empire and empire's replacement with nationalism, right? And with other politics. And I guess you could call them, in a sense, a sort of identity politics, right?
Sure.
But used in a very different way than they are in our modern moment, in which, ideology will take over And that ideology will be, anarchist ideology, or it will be fascist ideology, or it will be communist ideology. And in the trenches of World War I and around those trenches, you really have the death of the European empire and the rise of these, both of nationalism, which has already, of course, been rising in the 19th century, but really will come to a head and shatter the Austro-Hungarian Empire and shatter the Ottoman Empire, and shatter the Russian Empire as it was and lead to the Soviet Union. So you have all these moments of fragmentation, and that's sort of what I try to capture with this idea of people around smaller and smaller fires, right? Like what becomes important to people becomes more and more localized, more and more based around some very narrow set of conditions, right? So again, it's not about just being a Jew. Now it's about what kind you are, right? And what you believe, and who you're fighting for. So there's no more of this sense of the collective. And as that falls apart, new things come to rise up, right? And those are not good things necessarily, right? I mean, nationalism replaces empire, but nationalism is about a certain kind of very false identity, right? Like what makes a German, and what makes a Russian, and a Pole. And you start kind of picking apart the seams between people, and the world falls apart.
Yeah.
Right. Around ethnic hate quite often.
Well, my last question takes us back to the very beginning of the book. It's a passage you included in the epigraph called Mutual Aid, A Factor of Evolution by Pyotr Kropotkin.
Yes, Kropotkin.
Kropotkin,
Exactly.
Thank you. The war of each against all is not the law of nature. Mutual aid is as much a law of nature as mutual struggle. And that's very striking. How did you come across that text, and why did you want to center this idea of mutual aid?
I actually don't remember exactly how I came across Prince Kropotkin's text, but he wrote this book when he was a younger man and still working as a biologist, and he had done some field work in Siberia. And what he had noticed was that animals, especially when resources are abundant, aren't really in competition with one another for those resources, and they form large cooperative groups, and they provide one another with aid. And he thought that this contrasts completely with Darwin's ideas. But he wasn't arguing so much against Darwin's ideas, because Darwin's ideas are a little bit more complicated, right? His books have become classics in the sense, the Mark Twain sense of being books that everyone wants to have read, but nobody wants to read. And therefore, very few people have actually read them.
Sure.
But what we have been left with after them is really what Kropotkin was arguing against, which is this idea that societies are based around competition and that they are about survival of the fittest. And that's exclusively how animals evolve. And that's what behavior is all based around. And that becomes this poison that gets taken into society, and it justifies all sorts of hierarchical structures. It means that if you're rich and successful, it's because, you're better than people who are not, et cetera. And it basically, what he's arguing against is not Darwin, but the effect that Darwin has on a wider society. And what Kropotkin says is, if we return to watching animal behavior, this is not what we see. What we see is that he doesn't deny competition. Competition occurs. But competition is not the base behavior. The base behavior is cooperation. The crow, for example, is a perfect example of this, and birds in general are good examples of them. The crow's niche, the place where the crow lives and survives, is not a forest. Crows don't survive in the forest. Crows are social animals, and their niche is the flock. And the flock survives in a forest.
Got it.
Right? As this larger entity. So the flock's niche is the forest. The crow's niche is the flock. And human beings are exactly the same, right? Human society survives in the world, but humans survive in society, right? So this is why you get, Aristotle says, politikon o anthropos zoon, right? What he means is it's not man is a political animal, which is a very bad translation, but it's the one that we hear the most. It's the human being is a social creature, right? And when you think about this, right, then you sort of understand what Kropotkin is talking about, because human beings of course, can't survive with constant conflict. And we don't have constant conflict.
Sure.
We don't live in constant conflict. We live in constant cooperation with one another, interspersed with times of conflict.
Sure.
All these little 1,000 moments of cooperation, but sometimes what we think about is these 10 moments of conflict, right? Or these 10 moments of competition that come up amongst those 1,000 moments of cooperation. And cooperation is like this invisible atmosphere that we live in. And that's really what Kropotkin is talking about, is that the invisible atmosphere of life, the totality of life, is mostly about mutual aid and cooperation.
You know a lot of stuff about a lot of stuff, Ray. What's your research situation?
I just, for me, I think like writing is just a scaffolding that I've built around being really curious about things.
I love that.
It's just this way to have an excuse to be interested in anything I feel like being interested about.
What a gift. My gosh. Well, I have one last thing for you, Ray.
Sure.
Before I let you get on your tour. So you know that feeling when you need some help? A little mutual aid for the soul, perhaps. You're stuck in a rut or stuck in your feelings or stuck in a dangerous place. So you need a book or a meal or a way to get unstuck. This is recommended if you liked Palaces of the Crow and Mutually Beneficial Relationships with Corvids with Ray Nayler. So we're looking for recommendations of all sorts, to be clear. This could be anything that gets you into spaces of caring for others, looking a little more carefully at the world around you, some of that curiosity.
Well, let's see. I think one of the writers that I really wish was better known is a writer called Lee Sandlin.
Okay.
And he didn't write very much, but he wrote an amazing essay called Losing the War, which is available online for free. And you can very easily search it. And it's about World War II and the myth building that occurred in the United States around the war, and how we're really losing the granular sense of what the war was like. And it was also one of the sort of roots of inspiration for this book. But Lee Sandlin is also just such a beautiful writer. And everything that he wrote about, he writes about the freeways in the United States. He writes about the Mississippi River. He writes about all of these things. And whatever he touches, he just creates these beautiful sentences that I can't get enough of. I could read his work over and over again.
Yeah. That's awesome. I feel that way about my first recommendation, which is The Strange Bird by Jeff Vandermeer. I love Jeff Vandermeer's style. Like, The Strange Bird was like a weird, modern, epic poem about a woman who has been turned into a bird, and they don't really get into why. And she goes searching the world for her identity, essentially. And it's just kind of beautiful and odd, and he never really stops to explain this world, and you don't really need him to, because you're just on this adventure with her. It's really lovely. I've read it maybe a dozen times because it's also a really quick read. I'd also recommend The Genius of Birds by Jennifer Ackerman.
Oh, that's so good.
It's so good.
Yeah.
It gives you, I was thinking about it a lot while reading The Palaces of the Crow, because it just gives you that extra little insight into these incredible creatures that live around us.
Yeah, they're really amazing, and that's a wonderful book. I really like. You made me think of Jeff Vandermeer. So I was his interlocutor for an event that he did in Baltimore, and
wow.
And I know him. We've done a few events together. He also was my interlocutor for an event that I did at Powell's in Portland last year. But yeah, he's great, and I love that about him, that he doesn't want to just tell the reader what to think. It's something that I strive for in my own writing. Like, you want to give the reader space to just figure things out for themselves, because readers are so smart.
Totally.
Right?
Just like the birds that we read about sometimes.
Exactly.
Ray Nayler, author of Palaces of the Crow, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Katie.
And thank you for listening to Meet Me Here. Meet Me Here is produced by KUOW, a proud member of the NPR network. It's hosted by me, Katie Campbell, Dyer Oxley, and Jeannie Yandel. And it's produced by Brandy Fullwood, Kyle Norris, and Matt Martin. Our editor is Phyllis Fletcher. You can find more and support the show at kuow.org/meet. And don't forget to meet me back here for the next regularly scheduled episode on Wednesday.
Support comes from the Seattle Rep, presenting Freak the Mighty, a world premiere musical from the Tony Award-winning producers of Come From Away. Based on the beloved novel by Rodman Philbrick, this heartwarming story of friendship, resilience, and growing up follows two outsiders whose bond transforms their lives. On stage starting July 30th. Tickets at seattlerep.org.
Support comes from the Seattle Public Library announcing Summer Quest, a new summer learning program for all ages. Participants can read, do, and go to complete squares on a tracker and win prizes. Trackers are available at all library locations and at spl.org/summerquest.